Prairie Village, Kansas. October 24, 1995. Shortly after midnight. Dr. John Foreman was woken by his dog barking. Then the doorbell. Then knocking at the side door of his house, urgent, insistent, the kind of knocking that bypasses the part of you that would prefer to stay asleep. He went downstairs, forgot to deactivate the burglar alarm, opened the door. The alarm began to scream. His neighbor Deborah Green was standing on his doorstep in a pink nightgown, white collar and cuffs, an almost whimsical pattern. She was a physician, an oncologist. She and her husband Michael Farrar, also a doctor, had moved into the house next door at 7517, Canterbury Court with their 3 children, Tim, 13, Kate, 10, and Kelly, 6, the previous year. The Foremans and the Farrars were not particularly close neighbors. They knew each other the way affluent professionals know their affluent professional neighbors in an upscale Kansas City suburb. By sight, by occasional courtesy, by the comfortable distance that large houses and busy lives maintain between people who have no particular reason to need each other. Deborah Green needed John Foreman now. She needed him to call 911. She said her house was on fire. He looked past her and saw the glow. Not a small glow. The kind that comes from a house that has been burning long enough for the fire to have made decisions about which rooms to keep and which to give up. He called 911. The fire department arrived. By the time they reached the children's bedrooms, the heat was beyond what the hoses could answer quickly enough. Timothy Farrar, 13 years old, died in the fire. Kelly Farrar, 6 years old, died in the fire. Kate Farrar, 10 years old, escaped. Deborah Green escaped. Michael Farrar was not in the house. He had moved out of the family home 18 days earlier, into an apartment nearby, as the marriage he had been trying to leave for months finally became something he could no longer stay inside. In the weeks that followed, the fire investigators found what they found. Multiple points of origin. Accelerant pour patterns on the main floor and the second floor. Isoparaffins in the debris, consistent with ignitable liquids. The trail of accelerant led back to the master bedroom, Deborah's room. In the master bathroom vanity, a self-contained area of fire that had nothing to do with the spread from below. The forensic report was unambiguous. This fire had been set deliberately, by someone who knew the house, who had moved through it systematically, who had poured the accelerant in patterns designed not simply to start a fire but to control where it could and could not be escaped. 2 of the 3 children had been in the rooms the fire was designed to reach. The one who escaped was the one the fire was not designed to stop. The investigation that followed would establish something else. In the weeks before the fire, while Deborah Green was living in that house with her children, she had been poisoning her husband. Not in a fit of rage. Not impulsively, with whatever was available. She had been poisoning him with ricin, one of the most lethal substances known to medicine, derived from castor beans, essentially undetectable by standard toxicological screening, extraordinarily difficult to trace. She had obtained the castor beans herself, from a garden center, telling the manager they were for a science fair project. She had processed them. She had administered the resulting substance in her husband's food, on multiple occasions, over weeks. She was an oncologist. She had studied chemistry before medical school. She understood, at a cellular level, what ricin does to a human body and how to administer it to produce the desired outcome. She understood that it breaks down quickly in the bloodstream, making it difficult to detect. She understood the doses required. She understood the timeline. She applied this knowledge the way she applied all knowledge, methodically, precisely, with the training of someone who had spent decades learning how the body works and how to intervene in its processes. She applied it to her husband. This is the story of Deborah Green. Of a physician who used her medical training to kill. Of a mother who set fire to her own house with her children inside. Of a marriage that collapsed and a woman who decided, in the specific way that this particular case forces you to consider, that the appropriate response to being left was to make the leaving cost everything. Before I continue, if you're still here, you're exactly who this channel is made for. Subscribing to Glen genuinely keeps me going. It takes 1 second and it means more than you'd think. Deborah Jones was born on February 28, 1951, in a small town in Indiana. She was, by every account of her early life, exceptionally intelligent. an IQ later measured at 165, the kind of student whose capabilities are visible early and who moves through educational institutions with the momentum of someone who has always been told that achievement is what she is for. She studied chemical engineering as an undergraduate, then medicine, then specialized in oncology and hematology at the University of Kansas Medical School. She was, by the time she entered practice, a physician of genuine competence in a demanding specialty, the kind of doctor whose patients were fighting for their lives and who needed someone precise, knowledgeable, and unflinching about difficult information. She met Michael Farrar at medical school. He was 4 years younger, also high-achieving, also on the path to medicine. He became a cardiologist. She was attracted to his stability and ambition. He admired her intelligence and her drive. They married in 1979. Their first child, Tim, was born in 1982. 2 daughters followed, Kate, then Kelly. By the early 1990s they had the external architecture of a life that corresponded entirely to what their educations and their professions had prepared them for. A large Tudor-style house in Prairie Village, professional success, 3 children, a position in the fabric of their community. The internal architecture was different, and had been for years. The marriage had been difficult in ways that the people around them described, after the fact, as having been visible but not alarming, the kind of difficulty that exists in many marriages and that most marriages survive. Deborah drank. The drinking had been a feature of the marriage for long enough that it had its own established patterns, its own relationship to stress and disappointment. When things were going badly, the drinking got worse. When the drinking got worse, her behavior became erratic in ways that alarmed the children and exhausted Michael. She had, at times, been dependent on prescription medication as well, the management of anxiety and mood through whatever the pharmacy offered, the self-medication of a person whose interior life exceeded the tools she had available to manage it. By the mid-1990s she had stopped practicing medicine to care for the children at home, doing some freelance medical peer review work. The decision meant she was more isolated from the professional identity that had defined her since her 20s, the oncologist, the specialist, the doctor. She was at home. Michael went to work. Michael had a professional life that continued to expand while hers contracted. The asymmetry was one of the standing features of the marriage and one of its standing resentments. In early 1995, Michael and Deborah traveled to Peru. The trip was, in Michael's mind, an attempt to salvage something, or perhaps simply to reach a conclusion that he already knew was coming. While in Peru, he met a woman named Celeste Walker, the wife of a colleague, someone both Michael and Deborah knew. The attraction was immediate and mutual. When they returned to Kansas, Michael contacted Celeste. An affair began. Deborah found out. The specific sequence of discovery is not fully documented, but the effect is, she knew, and what she knew confirmed and amplified everything the marriage had been building toward for years. Michael was 4 years younger. Michael was still practicing, still professionally active, still moving through the world with the ease she had envied even before there was a specific reason to envy it. Michael was having an affair with a woman she knew. In late July or early August 1995, Michael told Deborah he wanted a divorce. It was not the first time he had said this. He had raised the possibility in 1994 as well, and the couple had discussed reconciliation, had even considered buying the Prairie Village house together as a new start, before Michael withdrew the offer and the Missouri house caught fire in May 1994 under circumstances that, in retrospect, carry a different weight than they did at the time. That fire was attributed to accidental causes. No charges were ever filed. The July 1995 divorce announcement was different in its finality. Michael meant it this time, and Deborah knew he meant it. The affair was real. The desire to leave was real. The marriage, which had been the container for her domestic life and her identity since she stepped back from medicine, was ending. And Deborah Green, oncologist, chemist, a woman with an IQ of 165 and a thorough understanding of how the human body can be made to fail, began to think about what she could do about it. What happened next happened in a sequence that the court records lay out with the precision of a medical history, because precision is what the evidence required and what the prosecution built its case around. August 4, 1995. Deborah called Michael from the basement of their house, where she was hiding. She said she was walking the streets of Kansas City hoping someone would kill her. Michael's response to this call is not fully recorded, but it did not produce what she was, perhaps, hoping it would produce: a reversal of the decision to divorce, a return to the marriage, some confirmation that she was worth staying for. August 11, 1995. Michael became ill. The symptoms were severe: violent gastrointestinal distress, weakness, the kind of acute deterioration that sends people to emergency rooms. His doctors could not identify the cause. He was hospitalized on August 18. His condition was considered life-threatening. He stabilized and was released on August 25. August 25. He returned home, not to live, but because he was concerned about Deborah's ability to care for the children alone. Within hours of arriving, after eating food Deborah had prepared, he became violently ill again. He was hospitalized again. He stabilized. He was released August 30. September 4. He became ill again after returning home and eating. A third hospitalization, lasting until September 11. His doctors were still unable to identify the cause. The standard toxicological screening used in hospitals in 1995 did not test for ricin. Ricin was not a substance that appeared in the differential diagnosis of a physician treating a sick cardiologist in suburban Kansas City. It was a bioweapon. It was the substance the Soviets had used to assassinate Georgy Markov in London in 1978, delivered via an umbrella tip on a London bridge. It was not something that featured in the clinical thinking of doctors treating a middle-aged man with unexplained gastrointestinal illness in Prairie Village. What the doctors knew was that Michael Farrar kept getting sick at home and recovering in hospital. What this implied, given that the only variable between the two environments was the food, was not something that anyone was quite ready to say out loud. Deborah Green had studied chemistry before she studied medicine. She understood how ricin works. She understood that it inhibits protein synthesis at the cellular level, causing multi-organ failure in sufficient doses. She understood that it breaks down rapidly in the bloodstream, which is why standard screens missed it. She understood that ricin antibodies persist in the blood long after the substance itself has cleared, which is ultimately how it was detected, when a blood sample was sent to the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., after the fire. She had thought carefully about what she was using and why, and she had chosen it because her training told her it would be effective and her training told her it would be difficult to trace. At some point during the summer, Michael found castor bean packets in Deborah's purse. She told him they were for a science fair project. He later said he did not immediately connect the beans to his illness. That this seems extraordinary in retrospect is partly explained by the context. He was a cardiologist, not a toxicologist, dealing with his own severe illness while simultaneously trying to manage a collapsing marriage and his concern about his children's welfare. The castor beans in the purse were a data point that his mind, perhaps, was not ready to process to its conclusion. In September, he tried to have Deborah committed to a psychiatric institution. The attempt was not successful. On October 5, he moved out of the family home. 19 days later, the house burned down. The night of October 23, 1995, was a Thursday. Michael had picked up two of the children, taken them to a hockey game, and returned them to the Prairie Village house at 8:45 in the evening. He then went to spend the night with Margaret Hacker. At some point that evening, he and Deborah spoke on the phone. The conversation was volatile. The specific content of what was said is not fully recorded, but the trajectory of what followed suggests that whatever was said in that call was the final proximate cause of what happened next. The children went to bed. Tim, 13, in his room on the upper floor. Kelly, 6, in her room on the upper floor. Kate, 10, in a room that the fire would not reach. Deborah moved through the house. The accelerant was poured in patterns. The fire investigators would later describe the pour patterns with a specificity that told you something about the planning involved. This was not a fire started in a moment of rage with whatever was at hand. The accelerant had been obtained and positioned. The patterns were designed. The master bathroom vanity was set separately, as a secondary point of origin, suggesting someone who understood that a single source could be explained away and multiple sources could not but was doing it anyway, past the point of caring about explanation. She poured the accelerant near Michael's belongings. She poured it in ways that cut off the routes from the upper floor bedrooms to the exits. The stairways leading to the children's rooms were soaked, a wall of fire that would rise between the children and the ground floor before they could reach it. She poured too much near her own bedroom door. Her bathrobe and hair sustained burns because she miscalculated the proximity to herself. Then she left. What happened in the minutes after she left, in the house that was by then burning, is partly reconstructed from witness accounts and partly from what the fire itself recorded in the pattern of its damage. Tim woke. He found himself in a burning house. He made it to a terrace or balcony, the accounts vary on the specific location, and he called down. Deborah was outside. Tim asked whether he should jump. Deborah told him to go back inside because she was getting help. He went back inside. He died there. This detail, Tim on the terrace, Deborah below, the instruction to go back inside, is the detail that the case turns on for anyone trying to understand what Deborah Green intended that night. If she had meant for her children to survive, the response to a child on a terrace asking whether to jump would have been to tell him to jump, to catch him, to find a way to get him out. The response to tell a child in a burning house to go back inside and wait is the response of someone for whom that child's survival was not the objective. Whether this was a deliberate act of murder or a catastrophic failure of the decision-making of a woman in a state of acute psychological breakdown, whether the Deborah who stood below the terrace had made a choice or had ceased to be able to make one, the Alford plea did not require an answer to this question and she has never provided one. The legal record established that she killed 2 of her children. The question of what she understood herself to be doing in the specific moments of the fire remains unanswered. Kelly Farrar was 6 years old and did not reach a terrace. She died in her room. Then she left through a door that the fire had not yet reached and walked across the lawn to the foreman's house in her pink nightgown and rang the doorbell. The fire department arrived. The firefighters fought the heat in the upstairs rooms. Timothy and Kelly Farrar were found. They could not be saved. Kate was found and brought out alive. Deborah Green stood on the street in the Kansas night and watched her house burn. What she said, what she did, how she presented herself in those hours, these details are recorded in the accounts of the neighbors and the firefighters and the officers who arrived on scene. She was described as distressed, as shocked, as behaving in the way that a woman who had just lost 2 children in a house fire might reasonably be expected to behave. Whether the distress was genuine, and in what proportion it was genuine, is the question that has never been fully answered. The prosecutors concluded that she had set the fire knowing her children were inside. They concluded she had been willing to kill them to punish Michael. The evidence they built their case on supported this conclusion. What it could not fully account for was the interior experience, whether she had intended both children to die, or whether she had believed Kate, and perhaps the others, might escape. Whether the fire was meant as a threat that went wrong or as a deliberate act of the worst possible kind. This question was never resolved at trial, because there was no trial. There was a plea. The investigation proceeded through October and into November. The fire investigators produced their report on November 10, establishing the fire as intentionally set. The connection to the ricin poisoning was established when blood samples taken from Michael during his hospitalizations were tested at the Naval Research Laboratory and showed the presence of ricin antibodies. The 2 investigations, the arson and the poisoning, converged on the same person through entirely separate evidentiary paths, which made the case against Deborah Green unusually strong from the prosecution's perspective. On November 22, 1995, shortly after Deborah had dropped Kate off for ballet practice at the Midland Theatre in Kansas City, police arrested her on the street. Her attorneys had asked that if an arrest were imminent, she be allowed to turn herself in voluntarily. The police and the district attorney declined, judging her behavior too unpredictable to allow an arranged surrender. She was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 1 for the fire as it related to Kate, 1 for the ricin poisoning of Michael, and 1 count of aggravated arson. The bail was set at $3 million. This was the highest bail ever required in Johnson County, Kansas. The amount communicated the prosecution's assessment of both the severity of the charges and the risk that Deborah Green, if released, represented to the people around her. She maintained her innocence throughout the pretrial period. The defense attempted to attribute the fire to Tim, who had once been caught by local police setting off Molotov cocktails, a detail that the defense presented as evidence of a troubled young man capable of the act. The defense also attempted to attribute the ricin poisoning to Tim, who had done much of the cooking in the household. The argument required the jury to believe that a 13-year-old boy had independently obtained ricin, understood how to process it from castor beans, and administered it to his father in food over multiple occasions, a scenario that the prosecution correctly identified as implausible and that the forensic evidence did not support. The defense's own investigators, reviewing the forensic evidence, concluded that the case against Deborah Green was stronger than the defense's public position acknowledged. When this assessment was communicated to Green herself, the calculus of continuing to fight the charges became untenable. In April 1996, Deborah Green entered an Alford plea to all charges. An Alford plea is a specific legal mechanism under which a defendant pleads guilty while maintaining that they did not commit the crime, acknowledging that the prosecution has sufficient evidence to convict without admitting to the acts themselves. It is, in practice, a way of accepting the consequences of guilt without the full verbal acknowledgement of guilt. It is the plea of someone who has been advised that the evidence will bury them and who is not, even now, fully prepared to say what they did. The preliminary hearing itself had been an event. Anne Rule, the true crime writer whose books about Ted Bundy and other cases had made her one of the most widely read authors in the genre, attended with an assistant to take notes. The prosecution had assembled a roster of 300 prospective witnesses. The courthouse in Olathe had set up overflow rooms for media. The 60 seats in the courtroom were not sufficient. Michael Farrar appeared at the hearing with a partially shaved head. He had required brain surgery in December 1995 to drain an abscess caused by the ricin poisoning. He was also making $5,400 monthly payments to Deborah as part of the divorce proceedings, which were continuing alongside the criminal case with a particular seriality. He had been poisoned. He had required brain surgery. He was paying his poisoner $5,000 a month. This is what the law required, and the law proceeded accordingly. The defense, at the hearing, attempted the same arguments it had tried before. Tim had set the fire. Tim had poisoned the food. The accelerant evidence was the product of junk science. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence in detail. The pore patterns. The multiple points of origin. The accelerant detected in the debris. The ricin antibodies in Michael's blood, identified by the Naval Research Laboratory. The 2 purchases of castor beans, including the one in September when the growing season was over and the manager remembered her face. When the defense's own investigators reviewed the evidence and concluded it was as strong as the prosecution maintained, the calculus of fighting it to trial became untenable. Deborah Green entered her Alford plea. She acknowledged that the state had sufficient evidence to convict her. She did not say she had done it. On May 30, 1996, she was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 40 years. The sentence carried the weight of what the evidence had established: 2 children dead, a husband poisoned, a fire set to cut off escape routes. The judge sentenced her accordingly. Kate Farrar, 10 years old when her mother set the fire, did something that surprised many observers in the period after the plea. She left a vase of roses at the courthouse for Deborah. She spoke to her mother on the phone regularly. The loyalty of a child to a parent is not simple, and it does not follow the lines that observers from outside the relationship expect it to follow. Kate had escaped the fire. She had also lost her brother and her sister and her family and whatever version of her childhood she had expected to have. Whatever she felt about her mother, she felt it in all of its complexity, not in the clean categories that the case required for public consumption. By the time of later hearings, when Deborah petitioned for review of her sentence in the mid-2000s, arguing that new arson science had undermined the evidence against her, Kate was 19 and sat in the courtroom with Deborah's supporters, not with Michael. Michael sat elsewhere. The distance between them in the courtroom was a diagram of what the fire had done to what remained of the family. District Judge Peter Ruddick rejected Deborah's petition in 2005. The evidence was not undermined by new science, he found. The conviction stood. Michael Farrar survived the ricin poisoning. He required surgery in December 1995 to treat a brain abscess caused by the poisoning, one of the long-term neurological consequences of ricin exposure. He went on to practice cardiology in Kansas City for decades, at North Kansas City Hospital, where he worked for 44 years until his death in August 2023. He was 68 years old. His obituary, published in the Kansas City Star, described him as someone who had excelled at everything he did, from Eagle Scout to physician to member of his community. It did not mention Deborah Green. It did not need to. Kate Farrar, the daughter who survived, grew up and eventually attended hearings where Deborah sought review of her sentence. She sat in the courtroom on the opposite side from her mother. The ricin. This is the element of the case that separates it from the category of domestic violence cases that produce terrible outcomes, and places it somewhere more specific and more disturbing. Ricin is extracted from the beans of the castor plant, Ricinus communis, and is among the most toxic naturally occurring substances known. A single milligram can kill an adult. It works by entering cells and preventing the synthesis of proteins, causing the affected cells to die, spreading systematically through organs until the failure is irreversible. There is no antidote. Treatment is supportive, managing symptoms while hoping the body can process and clear the toxin before the cumulative damage becomes fatal. In 1995, there was no standard clinical test for it. Detection required specialist laboratory analysis that no hospital in Kansas City would have ordered on a cardiologist presenting with gastrointestinal illness. Deborah Green knew this. She had studied chemistry for years before she studied medicine. She understood the mechanism, the timeline, the detectability. She understood that she could administer ricin in food and that the symptoms it produced would be attributed to other causes by the physicians treating Michael, not because they were incompetent, but because ricin was not in their differential. It was not in anyone's differential in Prairie Village in 1995. It was a Cold War bioweapon and a theoretical poison, not a substance that turned up in the food of a suburban cardiologist. She had used her training to find the gap in the system, the substance that caused the symptoms but evaded the tests, the method that exploited the medical establishment's inability to imagine that a physician might use this particular tool on her husband. The clinical knowledge she had spent years acquiring, and that she had used to help patients manage life-threatening illness, she applied with precision to the project of killing the man who was leaving her. The castor beans were purchased twice. The first purchase was from a garden center, apparently in the summer of 1995. The second purchase was from an Earl May store in North Kansas City on September 20, 1995, after Michael had already been hospitalized 3 times and after the marriage had essentially ended. The assistant manager of the store confirmed her identity. She had special ordered the packets, telling him they were for her child's science fair project. September was an unusual month to purchase castor beans, the manager noted, because the growing season was over. No science fair project was ever identified. She was still trying. After 3 hospitalizations, after Michael had moved out, after the marriage was effectively over, she was still purchasing castor beans. The drive toward the outcome had not stopped when the first attempts failed. It had continued, with the same methodical attention to supply that characterized everything else she did. What this says about her state of mind in those weeks, about whether she was still operating within something that could be called rational planning, or whether the drinking and the deterioration and the rage had produced something that only resembled planning without actually being it, is a question the court records approach but do not fully answer. What the records do answer is the practical question. She had the knowledge. She had obtained the material. She had administered it. Michael Farrar had survived 3 poisonings only because his doctors had treated him for what they could identify and he had been strong enough to clear the toxin each time, and because Deborah had not been able to continue administering it once Michael stopped eating in the house. The fire was the alternative. Prairie Village, in 1995 and now, is the kind of suburb that the word affluent was designed to describe. Large houses on quiet streets. Good schools. Professional families. The kind of community where the vocabulary for what happened, a physician poisoning her husband, burning her own house down with her children inside, did not exist, because the community had no framework for it and no precedent. The neighbors described their shock in the press coverage of November 1995 with the consistency of people who are genuinely trying to understand something their world had not prepared them to understand. They knew Deborah loved her children. They knew the marriage had been difficult. They knew about the drinking. None of this added up to what had happened, and the gap between what they knew and what had occurred is the gap that this case sits in. A friend of Deborah's who lived in the same neighborhood, and Slegman, wrote an essay for Red Book magazine that was published in May 1996, while Deborah was awaiting sentencing. The essay described their friendship, the fire, the investigation, the dawning understanding of what her neighbor had done. Slegman wrote that she had noticed a change in Deborah in the months before the fire. The drinking, the erratic behavior, the moments of cruelty toward Michael in front of the children. She had thought it was a marriage in crisis. She had not thought it was this. Her essay ended with a sentence that the case warrants returning to. She wrote that it was possible an entirely different personality, dissociated from the Deborah she had known, had committed the crimes. That the Deborah she knew would not have killed her children. This sentence is understandable. It is also, the evidence suggests, incorrect, not because Deborah Green was two different people, but because the person who could do what she did and the person who made her neighbors feel heard and valued were the same person. The same intelligence. The same capacity for attention and care and precision. Applied, finally, to a different purpose. And Rule heard about the case and attended the preliminary hearing with a notebook and an assistant. Rule was at that point the most successful true crime writer in America. Her book about Ted Bundy, The Stranger Beside Me, had established her as someone who could find the human complexity in cases where the instinct was to reach for simple monsters. She had covered female killers before. She had covered domestic cases before. Something about the Deborah Green case held her attention in a specific way. The book she wrote, Bitter Harvest, published in 1997, became one of the most widely read accounts of the case. Rule described Deborah as someone of extraordinary intelligence, the IQ of 165, the chemistry degree, the medical training, whose emotional development had not kept pace with her intellectual one. A psychiatrist who testified at the proceedings described Deborah's emotional functioning as comparable to that of a toddler. Rule found this astonishing. Could a woman who had zipped through college and medical school, who had treated cancer patients, who had a biting and facetious wit, really be emotionally that undeveloped? The answer the evidence suggests is, yes. Not in every dimension. Not in the dimension of professional competence or intellectual performance, but in the dimension of managing disappointment, tolerating loss, accepting rejection, in the interior life that surfaces when the professional scaffolding comes down and the person underneath is exposed. Something had not developed that should have. And when the marriage ended and the professional identity was already gone and the drinking had removed whatever buffers remained, what was underneath acted. It acted with the tools available to it, which were considerable. She knew chemistry. She knew medicine. She knew how the body works and how to intervene in its processes. She used what she knew. And Rule noted, in the book, that no one in an alcoholic fog would have been capable of the intricate planning it took to locate, purchase, and process the castor beans. She was right. The ricin was not an impulsive act. The two purchases, the special ordering, the management of the dosage over multiple hospitalizations, the choice of a substance specifically because she understood its detectability profile, these were the acts of someone applying professional training to a specific problem. The drinking and the emotional deterioration existed alongside the planning. They did not prevent it. Deborah Green has refused, in every context in which she has been asked, to provide any detail about how she extracted and administered the ricin. A 2002 bioterrorism working paper, a document produced to help policymakers understand the illegal use of biological agents, included her case as one of the few documented examples of ricin use in a domestic context. The paper noted that she had refused to explain her method. The method remains unknown to anyone outside the case. It is one of the few details in an otherwise thoroughly documented case that has not been established. She understood what she knew. She did not share it. The house at 7517, Canterbury Court in Prairie Village was demolished in November 1995, within weeks of the fire. The city moved quickly. The lot was cleared. The neighborhood street continued to be a neighborhood street, with large houses and quiet evenings and professional families in the patterns of their lives. The fire that destroyed the house lasted a few hours. The investigation took a few months. The plea took a few more. The sentence was handed down in May 1996. What it cost was 2 children's lives, a husband's health, a daughter's childhood, and the accumulated weight of a career spent in medicine, all of it, finally, reducible to this: a physician who knew exactly what she was doing, and did it anyway, and stood in a pink nightgown on her neighbor's doorstep in the early hours of October 24, 1995, and asked someone else to make the call. Deborah Green is in her mid-70s. She is serving her sentence at the Topeka Correctional Facility. Her first parole consideration date is 2035. She will be 84 years old. Michael Farrar worked as a cardiologist at North Kansas City Hospital for 44 years and died in August 2023 at the age of 68, of causes unrelated to the poisoning, having outlived the marriage and the fire and the ricin and the headlines and the book and the Lifetime movie and most of what followed. Kate Farrar is in her 40s. She has a life. It is hers. Timothy Farrar was 13. Kelly Farrar was 6. They are buried in Kansas. If you like this story, check out the ones on your screen. The dark algorithm thinks you'll enjoy these too.